12-year-old Jerome had always been different from other kids his age. While his friends spent their afternoons playing video games or hanging out at the mall, Jerome could be found at the same spot every day after school. He sat on an old wooden bench near the chain-link fence that separated the residential area from the regional airport, watching planes take off and land with the fascination of someone witnessing magic for the first time. His grandmother, who had raised him since he was 5, often wondered about his unusual hobby. She would watch from their small kitchen window as Jerome walked the same path every day, backpack slung over his shoulder, heading straight for that bench. At first she worried he was lonely or avoiding something, but over time she realized this wasn't escapism. This was passion. Jerome lived with his grandmother in a modest house just 2 miles from the airport. The house had belonged to his grandfather, a mechanic who had worked on cars his whole life before passing away 3 years earlier. Maybe that's where Jerome got his eye for machinery, his grandmother often thought. The boy seemed to understand how things worked just by looking at them. The airport wasn't busy like the major hubs in big cities. It was a smaller regional facility that mostly handled private jets, charter flights, and cargo planes. But to Jerome, each takeoff was a small miracle. He had learned to identify different aircraft just by their sound. The deep rumble of a cargo plane was completely different from the high-pitched whine of a small private jet. He could tell you whether a plane was struggling with its engines or running smoothly, just by listening. Over the months, Jerome had started bringing a small notebook with him. He would write down the time each plane took off, what type it was, and any unusual things he noticed. His grandmother had bought him the notebook for his birthday, thinking he might use it for school. Instead, it became his aircraft log. The airport workers had noticed Jerome too. At first, security had been concerned about a young boy hanging around the perimeter fence every day. But when they talked to him, they realized he wasn't trying to cause trouble. He was just genuinely fascinated by aviation. Some of the friendlier ground crew members would even wave to him when they saw him at his usual spot. Jerome had developed what his grandmother called airplane instincts. He could sense when something wasn't quite right with a flight preparation. Maybe it was the way the ground crew moved, or how long they spent on certain checks, or the sound the engines made during warm-up. He couldn't always explain what seemed off, but he was rarely wrong. This particular Tuesday started like any other. Jerome had finished his homework quickly, grabbed his notebook, and headed to his observation spot. The weather was perfect for flying, with clear skies and minimal wind. It was the kind of day when pilots love to take off. As he settled onto his bench, Jerome noticed a sleek private jet being prepared for departure. It was a beautiful aircraft, much newer and more expensive looking than the usual planes that use this airport. The jet was pristine white with elegant blue stripes along its sides. Even from a distance, Jerome could tell this was the kind of plane that belonged to someone very wealthy. But something felt wrong from the moment he started watching the pre-flight preparations. The ground crew seemed different today. Instead of their usual methodical, almost relaxed approach to aircraft maintenance, they appeared rushed and nervous. Jerome had watched hundreds of these preparations over the past year, and he knew the normal rhythm. Today, that rhythm was completely off. One mechanic in particular caught Jerome's attention. The man kept looking around while he worked, as if he was worried about being watched. He spent an unusual amount of time working on something near the engine compartment, but his body language suggested he wasn't performing routine maintenance. His movements were quick and secretive, nothing like the careful, methodical work Jerome had observed from other mechanics. Jerome opened his notebook and started writing down what he was seeing. The time, the unusual behavior, the specific area where the mechanic was working. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was telling him something was seriously wrong. The mechanic finished whatever he was doing and walked away quickly, not bothering with the usual final checks Jerome had seen other mechanics perform. Instead of the confident professional demeanor of someone who had just completed important safety work, this man looked anxious to get away from the aircraft. As Jerome continued watching, he saw a black luxury car pull up to the aircraft. A tall, well-dressed man in an expensive-looking suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. Even from a distance, Jerome could tell this was someone important. The man's clothes, his confident walk, the way airport staff treated him with obvious respect, everything suggested this passenger was very wealthy and influential. The man briefly spoke with the pilot, shook hands with a few airport officials, and began walking toward the aircraft steps. Jerome felt his heart start beating faster. The wealthy passenger had no idea what Jerome had just witnessed. He was about to board a plane that Jerome was almost certain had been tampered with. Jerome looked around desperately, hoping to see a security guard or airport official he could tell about his concerns. But the closest security personnel were too far away, and the aircraft engines were already starting to spool up for departure. The familiar whine of jet engines preparing for takeoff filled the air. Time was running out. Jerome stood up from his bench, his notebook clutched in his hand. His grandmother had always taught him to speak up when he saw something wrong, even if adults might not take him seriously at first. She had told him that sometimes young people could see things that adults missed because they looked at the world differently. The wealthy passenger was now at the bottom of the aircraft stairs about to board. In just a few minutes, the plane would be taxiing to the runway. Once it took off, if Jerome's suspicions were correct, it might be too late to help. Jerome had never done anything like what he was about to do. He was naturally a quiet, observant kid who preferred watching to speaking up. But looking at that aircraft, knowing what he had seen, he realized that staying quiet might mean watching someone die. His hands were shaking as he gripped the chain-link fence. The engines were getting louder, and ground crew were starting to clear the area around the aircraft. Everything was proceeding normally from everyone else's perspective, but Jerome knew better. He took a deep breath, thinking about his grandmother's words about doing the right thing even when it was scary. Then he opened his mouth and began shouting as loudly as he could, his voice carrying across the tarmac despite the noise of the aircraft engines. What happened next would change not just his life, but the life of the man about to board that plane, in ways neither of them could have possibly imagined. Jerome's voice cracked as he shouted across the tarmac, but he didn't stop. His hands gripped the chain-link fence so tightly his knuckles turned white, and he pressed his face against the metal links, trying to get as close as possible to the aircraft. "Stop! Don't get on that plane!" he yelled, his young voice fighting against the growing noise of the jet engines. "Something's wrong. The plane was sabotaged." At first, nobody seemed to hear him over the engine noise. The wealthy passenger continued, climbing the aircraft steps, briefcase in hand, completely unaware of the desperate boy shouting from beyond the fence. The pilot was going through his pre-flight checklist, and ground crew members were performing their final safety checks around the aircraft. But Jerome didn't give up. If anything, seeing that nobody had heard him made him shout even louder. "Hey, listen to me. There's something wrong with that plane." His voice was getting hoarse, but he kept going. "I saw someone mess with it. Please, somebody listen." A security guard who had been checking vehicles near the terminal heard the commotion. First, Officer Williams had worked airport security for 8 years and had dealt with all kinds of situations, from lost passengers to suspicious packages. But a young boy screaming about sabotage from outside the fence? That was a new one. Williams jogged toward Jerome's location, speaking into his radio as he moved. "Control, this is Williams. I've got a juvenile outside the perimeter fence causing a disturbance. Kids yelling something about a sabotaged aircraft." As the security officer approached, Jerome turned toward him, relief flooding his face. Finally, an adult was paying attention. "Officer, please, you have to stop that plane," Jerome said quickly, pointing toward the private jet. "I've been watching from here every day for months. I know how the maintenance is supposed to look. Today was different. One of the mechanics was acting really strange, and he did something to the plane near the engine area. I wrote it all down." Jerome held up his notebook, pages fluttering in, the breeze created by the aircraft engines. Officer Williams looked at the kid, then at the plane, then back at the kid. In his experience, most disturbances near the airport were caused by people who were either drunk, mentally unstable, or trying to get attention. But this boy seemed different. He was clearly upset, but he wasn't acting crazy. He was trying to explain something specific. "Son, what's your name?" Williams asked, crouching down to Jerome's eye level. "Jerome. I live right over there with my grandmother." Jerome said, pointing toward the small house visible in the distance. Officer, I know this sounds crazy, but I watch planes here every single day. I know what normal looks like and what happened. Today wasn't normal. Please just ask them to check the plane before it takes off. Meanwhile, on the aircraft, the wealthy passenger had settled into his seat. Richard Caldwell was a successful tech entrepreneur who had built his fortune by paying attention to details others missed. Today, he was flying to an important business meeting that could determine the future of his company. He had no time for delays, but something made him look out the window toward the fence. Maybe it was the persistent shouting, or maybe it was instinct. But he found himself watching the scene unfold between the security officer and the young boy. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. Mr. Caldwell, we're ready for departure. Should be wheels up in about 3 minutes. Caldwell nodded, but he kept watching the boy at the fence. The kid was gesturing frantically, showing the security officer something in a notebook. There was something about the boy's desperation that reminded Caldwell of himself as a young person, when adults didn't take his ideas seriously just because of his age. Officer Williams was torn. Protocol said he should move the kid along and let the flight depart on schedule. But something about Jerome's story bothered him. The boy clearly knew a lot about aircraft and airport operations. His observations were specific, not vague like you'd expect from someone making things up. Tell me exactly what you saw, Williams said to Jerome. Jerome took a deep breath and opened his notebook. The mechanic, he was working on the hydraulic system area around 2:47 p.m., but he kept looking around like he didn't want anyone to see what he was doing. Normal maintenance takes about 15 to 20 minutes for that section, but he was done in less than 10, and he didn't do the final inspection check that mechanics always do. He just finished and walked away really fast. Williams looked at the notes. The kid had written down times, descriptions, even a rough sketch of where the mechanic had been working. This wasn't the work of someone making up a story for attention. By now, other airport personnel had noticed the commotion. The ground crew supervisor, Dave Martinez, walked over to see what was happening. He had worked at this airport for 12 years and knew most of the regular maintenance staff. "What's going on here?" Martinez asked. Williams quickly explained the situation. Martinez looked skeptical at first, but when he heard Jerome's detailed description of the mechanic's behavior, his expression changed. "What did this mechanic look like?" Martinez asked Jerome. Jerome described the man as best he could remember. Average height, wearing the standard maintenance uniform, but with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had seemed nervous and kept checking his watch. Martinez frowned. "That doesn't sound like any of our regular guys, and we didn't have any special maintenance scheduled for that aircraft today. Just the normal pre-flight check." That was when everyone realized this might be more serious than they initially thought. On the aircraft, Caldwell could see the discussion getting more intense. The security officer was now talking to other airport staff, and more people were gathering around the boy at the fence. His business instincts, the same ones that had made him successful, were telling him to pay attention. Caldwell unbuckled his seatbelt and walked to the front of the aircraft. "Captain, what's that commotion outside?" The pilot looked where Caldwell was pointing. "I'm not sure, sir. Looks like security is dealing with someone at the perimeter fence. Probably just a routine matter." But Caldwell's gut was telling him this wasn't routine. He had built his fortune by trusting his instincts, especially when something felt off. And right now, everything about this situation felt very off. "Captain, I want you to shut down the engines," Caldwell said firmly. The pilot looked surprised. "Sir, we're cleared for takeoff. Delaying now will mess up our flight plan and arrival time." "I don't care about the schedule," Caldwell replied. "Something's not right here. That kid out there is trying to tell us something important, and I want to know what it is before we leave the ground." The pilot hesitated. Passengers didn't usually make operational decisions about aircraft, but Caldwell wasn't just any passenger. He owned the plane and he was paying for the flight. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Caldwell?" Caldwell looked out the window again at Jerome, who was still talking animatedly to the growing group of airport personnel. The boy's desperation was obvious even from this distance. "Yes, I'm sure. Shut down the engines and find out what that boy has to say." As the jet engines began winding down, Jerome felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone was finally listening, but terror that he might be wrong. What if he had just embarrassed himself in front of all these adults? What if his observations were mistaken? But deep down, Jerome knew he wasn't wrong. His months of watching aircraft preparations had taught him to recognize normal patterns, and what he had seen today was definitely not normal. Now he just had to convince the adults that a 12-year-old boy's observations were worth taking seriously. The next few minutes would determine whether Jerome's courage to speak up would save a life, or whether he would become known as the kid who cried wolf at the airport. The silence that followed the shutdown of the jet engines was almost eerie. For the first time in what felt like hours, Jerome could hear his own heartbeat. All eyes were now on him, and he felt the weight of responsibility like never before. What if he was wrong? What if he had just caused a huge problem over nothing? Caldwell stepped off the aircraft, his expensive shoes clicking against the tarmac as he walked toward the growing group of airport personnel. He moved with the confidence of someone used to making important decisions, but Jerome could see concern in his eyes too. "I want to know exactly what this young man observed," Caldwell said to Officer Williams. His voice was calm but firm. "And I want a complete inspection of my aircraft before anyone gets back on board." Jerome felt his mouth go dry. He had never spoken to someone who seemed so important before, but as Caldwell approached the fence, he smiled at Jerome in a way that made the boy feel less nervous. "Son, I understand you've been watching aircraft here for a while. Can you tell me what made today different?" Jerome looked at his notebook, his hands still shaking slightly. "Well, sir, I've been coming here every day after school for about 10 months. I know how the maintenance crews usually work. They have a pattern, you know? They're careful and they take their time because safety is really important." Dave Martinez, the ground crew supervisor, nodded. "The kid's right about that. Our guys are trained to be thorough, not fast," Jerome continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "But today there was this one mechanic I'd never seen before. He was working on your plane around the hydraulic system area. That's a really important part because it controls the landing gear and other safety systems." Caldwell's expression grew more serious. As someone who had studied business and technology his whole life, he understood how critical hydraulic systems were to aircraft safety. "What exactly did this mechanic do that seemed wrong?" Caldwell asked. Jerome flipped through his notebook to the right page. "He was there for less than 10 minutes, which is way too fast for that kind of work, and he kept looking around like he was worried about being caught. When mechanics do their job properly, they're focused on the aircraft, not looking over their shoulders." Martinez was already calling other crew members over. "Did anyone authorize maintenance on the Caldwell aircraft today? And did we have any temporary workers or contractors on duty?" The responses he got made everyone more worried. No maintenance had been scheduled, no temporary workers had been approved for duty, and nobody recognized the description of the mechanic Jerome had seen. "This is serious," Martinez said to Caldwell. "If someone unauthorized was working on your aircraft, we need to find out what they did immediately." Caldwell nodded. "I want the best mechanics you have to inspect every inch of that plane, and I want airport security to review all the surveillance footage from today." Officer Williams was already on his radio, calling for backup and requesting that security supervisors review the camera footage. Within minutes, more security personnel arrived, along with the airport manager and the head of maintenance. Jerome watched as a team of mechanics approached the aircraft with their equipment. He felt proud that adults were taking his observations seriously, but also nervous about what they might find. Part of him hoped he was wrong, because that would mean no one was in danger. But another part of him knew his instincts were usually right. The lead mechanic, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had been working on aircraft for over 20 years, began examining the hydraulic system area Jerome had pointed out. She worked carefully, using specialized tools to check components that weren't visible from the outside. After about 15 minutes of inspection, Chen called out to the group, "Martinez, you need to see this." The urgency in her voice made everyone move closer to the aircraft. Chen was holding something small in her gloved hand, something that definitely didn't belong in an aircraft hydraulic system. "This is a small explosive device," she said, her voice steady but serious. It's designed to cause a hydraulic failure about 10 to 15 minutes after takeoff. If this had gone off while the aircraft was airborne, it would have been catastrophic. The words hit everyone like a physical blow. Jerome felt his legs go weak, and he had to sit down on the ground next to the fence. He had been right, but being right about something this terrible didn't feel good at all. Caldwell's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. How long until this device would have activated? Chen examined the device more closely. Based on the timer mechanism, it looks like it was set to go off about 12 minutes after the engines reached full power. If you had taken off on schedule, you would have been at cruising altitude when the hydraulic system failed. Officer Williams immediately called for federal authorities. This is now a federal crime, he told the group. The FBI and FAA will need to take over this investigation. While they waited for federal agents to arrive, airport security began reviewing surveillance footage. They found clear images of the suspicious mechanic Jerome had described. But when they ran his identification through their system, they discovered something disturbing. The man's name was Tony Rodriguez, and he wasn't supposed to be at the airport at all. He had been fired from his job at a different airport 6 months earlier for safety violations. Somehow, he had gotten access to this facility and the aircraft. More troubling was what they found when they traced Rodriguez's recent activities. His bank account showed a large deposit made just 3 days earlier, far more money than someone with his background should have had access to. Jerome listened to all this information with growing amazement and fear. What had started as him noticing something odd had turned into what the adults were calling an attempted murder case. Agent Sarah Thompson from the FBI arrived within an hour, along with investigators from several other agencies. She spent considerable time talking to Jerome, asking him to describe everything he had seen in detail. "You have very good observation skills," Agent Thompson told Jerome. "Your attention to detail and willingness to speak up probably saved Mr. Caldwell's life today." Jerome looked over at Caldwell, who was talking to other investigators near the aircraft. The wealthy businessman caught Jerome's eye and walked over. "Young man, I owe you more than I can ever repay," Caldwell said, crouching down to Jerome's level. "Your courage and sharp eyes prevented a tragedy today." Jerome felt embarrassed by all the attention. "I just did what my grandmother always tells me to do. She says when you see something wrong, you should speak up, even if people might not believe you at first." Caldwell smiled. "Your grandmother sounds like a very wise woman. I'd like to meet her and thank her for raising such a brave grandson." As the investigation continued, more details emerged about Rodriguez and who might have hired him. The FBI discovered that the money in his account had come from a shell company, which meant this wasn't just a random act of violence. Someone had specifically wanted Caldwell dead. Agent Thompson explained to Caldwell that he would need protection while they investigated who was behind the assassination attempt. "Someone went to a lot of trouble and expense to plan this," she said. "We need to find out who and why." Meanwhile, Jerome sat with his grandmother, who had rushed to the airport when she heard what had happened. She held his hand as investigators continued their work around the aircraft. "I'm proud of you," she whispered to Jerome. "You trusted your instincts and did the right thing, even when it was scary." Jerome looked at the aircraft, now surrounded by investigators and covered with evidence tape. "Grandma, what if I had been wrong? What if I had caused all this trouble for nothing?" His grandmother squeezed his hand. "But you weren't wrong, baby. And even if you had been, it would have been better to be wrong about something serious than to stay quiet and be right about something terrible." As the sun began to set, Jerome realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The boy who had spent months quietly watching planes was now at the center of a federal investigation, and his actions had saved the life of one of the wealthiest men in the country. But the biggest questions were still unanswered. Who wanted Caldwell dead, and why were they willing to kill him? 3 days after the incident at the airport, Jerome's life had turned completely upside down. FBI agents were still asking him questions, reporters wanted to interview him, and his quiet little neighborhood had become the center of media attention. But the biggest shock came when Agent Thompson visited Jerome and his grandmother with news that would change everything. Jerome, we need to tell you something important about Mr. Caldwell, Agent Thompson said as she sat in their small living room. He's not just a wealthy businessman. He's one of the most important tech entrepreneurs in the country, worth over $3 billion. Jerome's grandmother nearly dropped her coffee cup. She had known Caldwell was rich, but $3 billion was more money than she could even imagine. But there's more, Agent Thompson continued. Mr. Caldwell was scheduled to testify before Congress next week about some very serious corporate crimes. His testimony could send several powerful people to prison and shut down companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Jerome listened, carefully trying to understand why this mattered. So someone wanted to stop him from talking to Congress? Exactly, Agent Thompson replied. We believe the assassination attempt was designed to silence him permanently. If Mr. Caldwell had died in what looked like an aircraft accident, his testimony would have died with him. The FBI had been working around the clock to trace the conspiracy. What they discovered was far bigger than anyone had initially suspected. The shell company that paid Rodriguez was connected to a network of corporations involved in illegal activities that Caldwell had uncovered. Agent Thompson explained that Caldwell's tech company had developed software that could detect financial fraud. While testing the software, they had accidentally discovered a massive conspiracy involving government contracts, fake companies, and stolen taxpayer money. The people involved in this fraud knew that Mr. Caldwell's testimony would expose everything, Agent Thompson told Jerome. They were desperate enough to commit murder to keep their secrets hidden. Jerome felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had stumbled into. So if I hadn't said anything, Mr. Caldwell would be dead, and some very bad people would have gotten away with stealing millions of dollars from taxpayers, Agent Thompson finished. Your observations didn't just save one man's life. They protected an entire federal investigation. Over the next few days, more details emerged about the conspiracy. The FBI had arrested Rodriguez, but he was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The real masterminds were corporate executives and government officials who had been running their fraud scheme for years. Jerome learned that Caldwell's software had discovered over 50 fake companies that existed only on paper. These companies had been awarded government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but they never actually did any work. The money simply disappeared into the pockets of the conspirators. The fraud was so sophisticated that it had gone undetected for nearly 5 years. Without Caldwell's advanced software and his willingness to testify about what he had found, the criminals might have continued stealing for many more years. Agent Thompson visited Jerome again to update him on the investigation's progress. We've made 12 arrests so far, she told him, and we're still following leads to find everyone involved. Jerome was amazed that his simple observation about a suspicious mechanic had led to such a massive investigation. How did they even know Mr. Caldwell was going to testify? Unfortunately, there was a leak in the congressional committee, Agent Thompson explained. Someone told the conspirators about Mr. Caldwell's upcoming testimony, which gave them time to plan the assassination attempt. The FBI had also discovered that this wasn't the first time the conspirators had tried to silence people who threatened their scheme. 2 other potential witnesses had died in what appeared to be accidents over the past 2 years. With this new information, those deaths were now being investigated as possible murders. Jerome felt a chill when he heard this. The people behind the conspiracy had killed before, and they would have killed again if he hadn't spoken up. The weight of that responsibility was almost too much for a 12-year-old to handle. His grandmother noticed how the stress was affecting Jerome. "Baby, you did something amazing, but don't let it become a burden," she told him one evening. "You can't control what bad people choose to do. You can only control whether you do the right thing when you have the chance." Meanwhile, Caldwell was dealing with his own challenges. The FBI had assigned him a security detail because the people behind the conspiracy were still dangerous. He couldn't return to his normal life until the investigation was complete. But instead of hiding away, Caldwell decided to use this time productively. He visited Jerome and his grandmother several times, getting to know the family that had saved his life. During one visit, Caldwell learned more about Jerome's passion for aviation and his natural ability to observe mechanical systems. "Have you ever thought about studying engineering?" Caldwell asked Jerome. Jerome's face lit up. "I'd love to, but college is really expensive. My grandmother works hard, but we don't have money for things like that." Caldwell exchanged a meaningful look with Jerome's grandmother. What if money wasn't an issue? What if you could study whatever you wanted? Jerome's grandmother was suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. "Mr. Caldwell, we appreciate everything you've said, but we can't accept charity." "This wouldn't be charity," Caldwell replied. "This would be an investment. Jerome has already proven he has the observational skills and analytical thinking that engineers need. With proper education and training, he could accomplish incredible things." As the federal investigation continued, more shocking details emerged. The conspiracy had connections to organized crime, corrupt politicians, and even some foreign governments. What had started as a simple fraud scheme had grown into a threat to national security. Agent Thompson explained to Jerome how his actions had helped uncover all of this. "When you forced us to investigate Mr. Caldwell's aircraft, it led us to Rodriguez. When we investigated Rodriguez, we found the shell company. Following the money trail from the shell company led us to the entire network." Jerome was learning that real investigations weren't like the detective shows on television. In real life, solving crimes required following small clues that led to bigger clues, building a case piece by piece. The media attention continued to grow as more details about the conspiracy became public. Jerome found himself at the center of a story that was making headlines across the country. News reporters called him a hero, but Jerome didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a regular kid who had happened to notice something important. One evening, as Jerome sat in his bedroom looking at newspaper articles about the case, his grandmother came in to talk to him. "How are you handling all this attention, baby?" she asked. Jerome thought for a moment before answering. "It's weird, Grandma. People keep calling me a hero, but I just did what felt right. I didn't know it would turn into something this big." His grandmother sat on the bed next to him. "That's exactly why what you did was so special. Real heroes don't set out to be heroes. They just do the right thing when they see something wrong, even when it's difficult or scary." As Congress prepared for Caldwell's testimony, security around him was increased even more. The people behind the conspiracy were getting desperate, and the FBI worried they might try another assassination attempt. Jerome watched the news coverage of Caldwell's preparation for his congressional appearance. It was strange to think that the well-dressed man he had seen boarding that aircraft was now one of the most important witnesses in a major federal case. But the most important revelation was still to come. Agent Thompson had one more piece of information that would help Jerome understand just how significant his actions had been. "Jerome, we need you to know something else," she said during her final visit before Caldwell's testimony. The fraud that Mr. Caldwell discovered wasn't just stealing money. Some of the fake companies were supposed to be providing security services and emergency equipment. Because they never actually provided these services, people's lives were put at risk. Jerome felt his stomach drop. "You mean people could have been hurt because of the fake companies?" "People were hurt," Agent Thompson said gently. "We've found evidence that at least 3 emergency situations weren't handled properly because the equipment that was supposed to be there didn't exist. By helping us expose this conspiracy, you've prevented future tragedies too." As Jerome prepared for bed, that night, he thought about everything that had happened since that Tuesday afternoon at the airport. His simple decision to speak up about something that seemed wrong had exposed a conspiracy, saved lives, and changed the course of a major federal investigation. Tomorrow, Caldwell would testify before Congress, and the people behind the conspiracy would finally face justice. And it all started because a 12-year-old boy trusted his instincts and found the courage to raise his voice when it mattered most.